Okay, so we wanted to record a short lecture on how to craft or how to frame research questions. We call this good researchable questions, or ARID. ARID is just an acronym for research questions are answerable, relevant, interesting, and doable. And the reason why we name this lecture good researchable questions and not good research questions is because inherent in a good research question is that they're actually researchable, that we can actually collect data on it to answer those research questions. So that's why it's named good researchable questions are ARID. Um, the A in ARID is answerable, and I'm just going to really quickly go through this. I don't want this to be a super long lecture, but this is a useful, I think, PDF for y'all to engage with if you have questions about, how to craft or whether or not your research questions are ARID. So ARID, answerable by research. So the question that you craft must be one that can actually be approached by the research process. So a couple examples here, of things that are not so great, and then we have improved questions afterwards. The first question is, do people have knowledge so they can understand signage at wilderness trailheads? So this implies that a purpose for the knowledge that can't be tested. So you can't test whether or not people have knowledge so they can understand signage. In a better way of kind of thinking about this, and I think if you were to craft a question like this, you'd probably actually be wondering, about higher versus lower knowledge and what the implications of that are. So a better way to frame this question might be, does higher knowledge increase compliance with regulations presented on wilderness signage? This is answerable because you can measure high versus low knowledge, you can measure compliance, and you can measure the presence or absence of regulations on wilderness signage, right? So every aspect of this research question is answerable. Like we can collect data literally on every aspect of this. But this, like, you can't measure knowledge that has a purpose for understanding, right? Like you could measure higher or lower knowledge. You could measure the presence or absence of knowledge, but like you can't measure like the purpose of that knowledge for something like understanding signage or whatever. Another example of a kind of bad research question related to a different topic is what I'm going to talk about now. So also, when we're thinking about answerable questions by research, we want to think that questions about how to solve practical problems are sometimes not researchable. So a question like, how can I use signage to enhance compliance with littering regulations? That's not a research question. That's like a practical kind of practice-oriented question, right? Because it's not like, because it's you're not describing the world. You're not describing a phenomenon. You're just asking a question of like, how can I improve something? And research can only really describe how things work and how things currently work. It's not prescriptive. It can't tell you what you should do or how to do things necessarily, but it can inform those things, but it can't tell you how to do those things. So, a research question that could inform this kind of more practical question might be, to what extent does sign X reduce littering on Y trail compared to Z sign, right? So you can compare two different signs and you can measure the amount of littering and you can see, how much littering happens when people are exposed to X sign versus how much littering people do when they're exposed to Z sign, and then you can say that X or Z sign is better or worse on this particular trail, and then with that research, you can then help inform this question of how can I use signage to enhance compliance with littering regulations. But like this again isn't a research question. This is just a really good practical question, but it's not answerable by research. Sometimes questions just might be too broad or too vague to approach directly. So, this isn't really answerable. Like, why do people like nature so much? That's just too broad. And then, what is the impact of the National Park Service on national identity? These are both, I guess, really interesting questions, but they're just so broad and they're not really answerable by research in a in a succinct way. So in other words, these types of questions really require refinement into more specific questions. You could have a question about, why does X group get so much satisfaction from desert landscapes or something like that? Or, to what extent does Glacier National Park play into placemaking for international visitors or national or like Montanan visitors or something like that. Like there are different kind of questions that you could ask that could help inform these bigger, broader questions, but these questions are just way too big. Okay, so research questions, we've said that they're answerable, also they're relevant. So we need to know what is known already in the research and what needs to be researched. And we really need to rely on existing literature for that. This is what literature reviews are for. This isn't easy, it takes a ton of work, and we kind of need to know what questions are out there, what things have already been answered, and what we can do with our research to add on to the existing body of knowledge. To do that, you need to identify and assess what's known and what needs to be researched. So again, you search the literature, you might also ask colleagues, you might go to scientific society meetings, conferences, workshops, you might have personal contacts that you talk to, right? So it's not all in the literature, although in research proposals, you're definitely going to be referencing literature. But through conversation and through kind of social interactions, that can help identify like what's relevant or what questions need to be answered through research. Oops, I went the wrong way. Also, questions need to be interesting and creative. So we've said that they need to be answerable, they need to be relevant, and now we're talking about that they need to be interesting. I won't really go through these in detail, but does the question excite or interest you? Does it challenge your own thinking or the thinking of others? Does it question does the question address gaps or ambiguity in theory or in research or what have you? Are you comparing and explaining the difference between two events? These are just things that might be interesting to me. But these research questions really need to be interesting to you. They need to be interesting to other people. This will help sustain you in your research. If you're doing research on something that you don't find interesting or that nobody else finds interesting, it's going to be hard to sustain energy in completing that work. Something that helps me, and just the way my brain works, is that I like to dig deep into the kind of explanatory aspect of research. And I'm not just, asking what happened. You're really trying to ask like why it happened or how it happened. And I'm kind of going beyond the descriptive piece for me is something that's really fulfilling and interesting. I keep going back to this answerable. Okay, lastly, the research is doable. It's research that's technically feasible. It can be completed with your resources in a time frame, and you understand what methods to use and how to use them to answer your questions, right? So, in other words, just this research is just doable, right? You can do it. You can complete it. In conclusion, these research questions that we're going to come up with are ARID, right? They're answerable, they're relevant, they're interesting, and they're doable. I think early on in this informal lecture, I'll just go to the top. We called this lecture "Good Researchable Questions" or ARID. Again, just I think a major component that's not fully that's not specifically captured in each of these individual elements, but kind of speaks across all four of these elements: answerable, relevant, interesting, and doable. Or whether it's this question of whether or not they're researchable, right? So a researchable question is going to be answerable, right? You're going to be able to answer it. It's going to be relevant, right? If it's not relevant, and there's not a lot of research that exists before what you've done, it might not be really researchable because there might not be a lot of existing lit to kind of base it off of. So even though it might be answerable, it might not be kind of informed by previous work. That kind of takes away some of the researchability of it. but certainly you can still answer those questions. Is it interesting? I find interesting questions to be the ones that, for me, are just personally researchable. They sustain my work and make them researchable, and whether they're doable, right? Like, can you actually answer those questions? So I think when we think about aridness, like all of those things contribute to whether or not a research question is researchable. So I hope this is helpful. This is a really informal. This wasn't really a lecture. It's kind of more informal talk about what makes a good research question. And yeah, so please let us know if you have questions on any of this. We're so happy to talk about it.